Hello and welcome to another episode of the Merseyside Health Podcast. We've got a brilliant speaker lined up for you today, Dr. Phil Graham-Smith of Manchester Metropolitan University. He's an expert in the field of biomechanics and measuring human performance. He's the creator and co-founder of a company called Force Decs, which was later sold to Vald. And he's been measuring human performance in elite athletes, the likes of Jonathan Edwards and Asafa Powell, for many, many years. Formerly worked at the English Institute of Sport in the biomechanics role. He was a performance analyst and worked at the Olympics in London 2012 before going over to work at the Aspetar Academy in Qatar for 10 years. He's back now and he's with us on the podcast today, so really looking forward to getting his pearls of wisdom on all things human performance measurements. If you haven't had a chance to check out our introduction video to the podcast, it's just a short one, 2 or 3 minutes, and it just sets out what our aims are and what we're trying to do with this podcast, really. In a nutshell, we're trying to bring a wide variety of people and opinions from the Merseyside and that northwest region, and just make them available and make people aware of what's going on out there. So if you've got an interesting story to tell in the health and fitness space, perhaps you run a really niche club, perhaps you do work with a marginalized group that would generally find it difficult to access physical activity and exercise. Perhaps you do something really unusual. We've been in conversation with strong men and yoga teachers and boxing coaches. There's loads of people we've got lined up to come and speak to us about health and fitness in the Merseyside area. So just get in contact. We want to speak to you and get your story out there. Anyway, enough from me. Let's crack on, and I hope you enjoy this week's podcast. Okay, well, welcome everyone to our third episode of the Merseyside Health Podcast. I'm delighted today to be joined by Dr. Phil Graham-Smith of Manchester Metropolitan University, and he is Mr. Biomechanics and Force Plates, or Force Decs, I should say. And so I'm really pleased he's taken his time today to come and have a chat to us about all sorts of topics. So Phil, thanks for joining us. Where are we talking to you from today?
I'm currently over in Northern Ireland, visiting my family, my wife's family, should I say, who are from Northern Ireland. So it's over here for a couple of weeks over Easter, but looking forward to this conversation, and thanks for having me on.
Oh, our pleasure. So it's a journey for you, isn't it? So from West Yorkshire out to all sorts of interesting places and around the world, and now back to Manchester. Do you mind giving us a bit of a? I will just direct the listeners to the Physio podcast that you did, Life Stories with Andy, because I don't think we can beat that for a full run through. But perhaps if we could have a bit of an update from you, just for those that haven't heard it.
Well, yeah, from Elland in West Yorkshire, went to the Brooksbank School, was half decent at football and water polo. Interest in maths and sports science, went to Liverpool Polytechnic as it was. Did my undergrad in sports science there. Stayed on to do a PhD, working with the long and triple jump squads in the UK, the national squads. Had some subjects like Jonathan Edwards, Denise Lewis, Asher Hansen, a couple of world record holders there. And, as for someone who never done a triple jump in their life, or long jump, I'm now Dr. Long Jump, Triple Jump. But part of that was testing attributes of athletes. So some strength, power. So, my mentor, Professor Adrian Lees at John Moores, as it was later, we use force platforms all the time. And the problem then became when we moved from Acorn computers to PCs. We didn't have the software that Adrian had developed, so I used a spreadsheet copied a column data, it was a spreadsheet, and ultimately led me to think of a better workflow of how we can get data analyzed quickly, like what Adrian's system used to do with the Acorn computers. Anyway, that we'll come on to that probably later, but working with these jumpers meant that I was embedded in sport, high performance sport, and I needed to make my workflow better. From John Moores, I went to Salford Uni. Eventually, I spent 12 years there. I became head of department, associate head of school. Got a call one Thursday evening in October 2012 from my old head of department, Tim Cable. We'd gone out to Aspire in Qatar. Ended up going to Qatar in the May of 2013 for a 1-year sabbatical from Salford, which happened to be 10.5 years in the end.
And a World Cup as well.
And the World Cup, went to see 11 games there. It was unbelievable. It was nothing like what the media portrayed it over here, I have to say. So I'm a little bit cautious of what I listen to now from UK media, to be honest. But it was unbelievable experience, that. And partly being involved in the development of some of those players in Qatar for the national team. We used to do some testing of them, as well as athletes in many Olympic sports, fencing, athletics, swimming, you name it, table tennis. So that was 10.5 years. And my daughter's a physio. She graduated maybe 3-4 years ago. She's working now up in the Northwest region. And we thought maybe it's time to come back. So an opportunity came up in Manchester Met, and that's where I am now. I think mid-November I started there. So still quite fresh back into the academic scenario, but enjoying it and hoping to build a network again.
Yeah, well, yeah. So the Force Decs. Then, are you surprised at how many people are sort of familiar and how many people are using them? Then, because you mentioned your daughter's sort of coming into the physio profession. We've got some physios that work here with us, and they all seem to know everything about Force Decs. And I said, oh, we're going to get some Force Decs into the clinic. Oh yeah, we know all about them. We've used them in, undergraduate courses and stuff like that. Yeah. I've been quite surprised to find how widespread they are. Does it surprise you that they've gone right down to that entry level?
Not really. I think many years ago, force plates were very, very expensive. I remember the ones we had at John Moores, they were embedded into the floor. You can get portable ones, you can get embedded ones. The embedded ones take more construction to get them fit properly, flush with the floor. Supposedly should be on ground level, to stop vibrations from ceilings and things. But they've always been in the domain of biomechanics. And when the lottery funding kicked in the late 90s, when there was a move away from providing support in university settings to these high performance centers, there was a shift in mentality, I think. And with that came a transition of technologies into these places, where multidisciplinary teams were then working together. And what was, as I said, a biomechanist tool sort of has emerged into the domain of physios and S&Cs as well. And the problem used to be not so much collecting the data, but analyzing the data. Anybody can collect force data from a Kistler, an Amty, a Bertec, some of the big brands of triaxial force plates. But all you could really get out of it, unless you had specific software, was forces and time, the two things that it measures directly. Now, if you want to process it into getting movements of the whole body, center of mass displacements, jump heights, things like that, you need to process it. And that was a missing link, really. So what we found when we moved into these high performance centers was that there was portable force plates sitting on shelves or in the gyms that weren't being used. So Force Decs came about as a software solution to process data from multiple different force plates. And at the time, I'd found some really cheap ones, Pasco plates. They were £250 from SciChem, like a school's education distributor. And I connected with a guy called Ali Samir. And I still speak to him now. Whenever I'm back, I get a call now and again. And he provided me with these two Pascos to create a dual plate system. But what we found then was that it wasn't viable, because you had big rugby players jumping up and down on these, which were really only intended for kids or bouncing a ball on to do little science experiments. So we ended up creating our own force plates. And the majority of movements in clinics and gyms and sport, 90% of it can be done with just a vertical force. If you're going to run across something, you really need an embedded plate, which is triaxial. So that's another level altogether, which is more in the biomechanics laboratory domain there. So yeah, 90% of applications can be vertical force only on a portable force plate, and that's what we really hit, that market for gym-based, clinic-based, or whatever sport-related, that you can look at asymmetries using a dual force plate for the physio return to play sort of avenue, and the forces together to get performance outputs for the S&Cs. And then somewhere along the way, fatigue monitoring came in, where the physiologists got on board, and we're looking at, can we use jump testing to monitor whether an athlete's getting fatigued or not. So they're the three main applications of them, with the physios, the S&Cs, and the physiologists. And the biomechanists are probably just stuck in their laboratories still, wondering what's happened, because thanks to me and Dan Cohen, it sort of liberated force plates to the wider professions, really.
Yeah. Well, you're probably in those laboratories, but there's a dartboard behind the door, isn't there?
Yeah, because there's not much activity in them anymore. So
let's do force plates for dummies then. So what actually is the force plate? How does it work in the most basic sense?
Yeah. So I mean, force plates, there's nothing new to force plates. Force Decs, Vald, whoever, have not invented force plates. These have been technologies around for donkey's years. As I mentioned, three of the big brands before. They are essentially, there's four force transducers in each corner of a single plate. So if you were to buy a Kistler plate, there'd be four piezoelectronic crystal-based transducers in each corner. And there's a summation of those forces that give you the total force from wherever you stand within the platform. AMPT, Bertec use strain gauge-based technology. So the differentiation between those two. If you're using Kistlers with piezoelectronic ones, you don't want to be collecting data for more than 30 seconds. There's a bit more of a drift with those. With the strain gauge ones, you can collect for a minute, 2 minutes, probably without much worry. So Force Decs is based on strain gauges. So there's 4 strain gauges in each corner of each plate, and then you've got the other plate that separates your left foot and your right foot. So you can, and it does help with the algorithms to detect whether it's a single left leg jump or a single right leg jump and things like that. But yeah, it's basically strain gauge or piezoelectronic crystals that are calibrated, so we know the force that's been applied with the distortion of those sensors, and from that you can create what is effectively a very reliable weighing scale. In its basic form, it is a weighing scale. stand still, you measure body weight. It works on the principles of Newton's third law, action, reaction. Whatever force you apply, you get the equal and opposite reaction. So the beauty of having a force plate is that it samples, maybe 1,000 samples a second, 1,000 data points every second, and that allows you to look at the dynamic force response of these sensors. If you've got a normal set of weighing scales, it's not sampling at that sort of frequency, it's just collecting a static measurement. So it's the dynamic nature that allows us to build up these movement signatures of typical, tests that we would do. Like a squat jump is different, the force time curve is different from a squat jump to a counter movement to a drop jump to someone running over it. So there's very different force time traces for the different tests, and that allows us to separate it into different phases of movement and understand a little bit about the overall output of what the patient or the athlete is doing.
And that's what sort of takes it to that next level, because I can remember one of my first sort of exposures as a physio to strength and conditioning was down at Exeter University. They had some strength coaches that I was working in a badminton coaching role there, and they brought up these jump mats, and they were doing sort of testing with some of our squad players and doing some strengthening and then reevaluating them however many weeks later. And that was, I'm sure that was counter movement jump they were looking at. Then they were taking them away and having to do all this kind of, these complicated calculations and things like that. And after scraping my GCSE maths, I thought, oh no, that's no good for me. So jump mats, then, what is that the main difference? Is that sampling frequency and you can get all these extra little bits of information, or are the calculations?
I mean, if we focus on jumping, there's various ways in which you can measure someone's jump height, which is the performance output metric of that test. You ask someone to jump as high as they can. You could do chalk on a wall and look at the difference between stood on tiptoes to how the highest part that you make and measure the difference. There's string gauge things that you put around your waist that measure how much string has come out of the belt relative to the floor. And then there's contact mats, which basically measure the flight time. So all a contact mat is just a load of sensors that say, is somebody stood on this? Are they connected or not? And when they're released and there's nobody on it, starts your flight time. And when you make contact again, it says, stop. So you work out a flight time, and it's a very, very simple equation. That's it's gravity, 9.81 times a flight time squared all over 8. That's how you work out the jump height from flight time. And in many ways, Force Decs will give you the same measure of a contact mat type measure of flight time. It'll work out what that jump height is. But it also work it out using the force time trace with something called impulse derived jump heights.
So here we go. And I was wondering when it was all going to start going over my head.
So all impulses is force times time. So the area under the graph in basically the concentric phase of the movement equates to the change in momentum. So force times time equals mass times change in velocity. You start with the initial velocity of 0. So the area under the graph, the impulse, force times time, is your mass times velocity. So divide the impulse by mass, you get the takeoff velocity. From velocity, you then can work out what the jump height is using conservation of energy. So kinetic energy at the bottom, half mv squared, equals potential energy at the top of the flight, mass times g times h. So it's again, it reduces down to quite a simple calculation, just using kinetic energy, potential energy.
Don't start making us all feel bad by saying that's all very simple.
Well,
I'll just reassure the listeners and say your certificates for physics and maths will be sent out in the post if you manage to get through all that.
but you know, it boils down to force plates boil down to two things. Newton's third law, you don't need to worry about that. So long as the sensors are calibrated, whatever you put in, the force plate will recognize that in response to whatever the athlete puts in. So that's Newton's third law, is the underlying principle of measurement. And then the analysis of it is Newton's second law. The net force equals mass times acceleration. That's if you can understand that, you're absolutely fine. Yeah. We obviously make it slightly more complicated in that you've got two forces, one from the left plate, one from the right, but you simply add those together and perform that calculation. You know, so I mean, what I would say, it's not rocket science. It really isn't. It's if you can understand that your body weight acts down and whatever force you apply acts upwards in response to that. For body weight, they're the same. When you start applying force, it'll drop below body weight and it'll go above body weight. So the net force, the ground reaction force minus body weight equals mass times acceleration. And that's basically it. And from that, you can get obviously acceleration. You can get velocity. With force and velocity, you can get power. From velocity, you can derive displacement. Force times displacement's work done. So there's all these other variables that come from those basic, from force and time, you can get everything else.
Yeah,
you know,
and I think from that performance perspective, that's what people are really interested in, power, aren't they? Is my program developing power in my athletes, and using those force plates allows them to mark their own homework, or mark homework, I suppose.
Yeah.
They're not marking their own homework because the force plates is marking their homework, isn't it? Yeah. So the counter movement jump, then, that's probably the most researched of all these tests used on the force plate. And you get them on there, you get them doing their jump, try and get them all nice and standardized and right. And then you look at this nice little squiggly line, don't you? And then the patient pulls around and says, "Oh, what's that then?" So could you just talk us through those phases of the counter movement and I suppose specifically what's important in those? I think it's the eccentric and the concentric phases, isn't it? But also when you're talking about fatigue monitoring, what are you looking for when you look at those traces?
Right. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. There's a whole lot of research now on counter movement jumps. And I have to say, I think they're cheap and easy publications at the minute, because it's so simple to get a lot of mass data now. You know, when you use Force Decs, you can, test a lot of people quickly. Or let's do some normative data on rugby players. Let's do some normative data on whatever sport it might be, which is nice, but I think it also gets really cloudy then when you start going to different levels of fatigue monitoring and the application of it in different ways. So I would be careful with how much you read, because it can get confusing. So that's just a little word of caution.
Well, don't worry, I don't get a chance to read it anywhere near enough anyway. So over reading is not the problem I'm facing at the moment.
Good. Well, what I always say now is understand the principles of what it's giving you before you go into such called evidence-based, which is low quality evidence in many cases. And that's just not force plates. I think it's widespread across sports sciences and sports medicine as well. I guess there's a lot of nonsense, cheap publications that have performed pretty badly, and with the age of the immediacy of information, you're getting hit with this wealth of very, very average, if not poor, research that's been published somewhere. And I think that just your ability to critique these sort of things has got to be so good now, because everyone's talking about evidence base, but the quality of evidence is so poor. I think we've got to pin it on fundamental knowledge of the principles of what you're looking at, really. So as I said, Newton's laws for force plates. Right, I digressed a bit there, but I'm glad I got that off my chest. Counter movement jump. So you start off, you've got to have your athlete, your patient stood still. It's measuring body weight at that point. When they're stood still with the feet equal distribution around the midline, they're dead still, no twitching the toes, no moving the head. Any movement can affect that force trace. So we're looking for a really good quality measurement of body weight. When it deviates 20 newtons from that measured body weight, you then sink, you bend your knees, you flex your hips, you're going into the counter movement. That's called unweighting. So you will see that the force goes below body weight. When you come to the bottom, or you start slowing down that downward movement, you will see the force rise up. And at the bottom of the movement, the force will be way above body weight, surprisingly, because I think a lot of people think that when it goes to the trough, that's where you finish your counter movement. It's not. You will pass body weight and go higher than body weight at the bottom of the counter movement depth, right? So what you end up then is having a concentric phase, which starts close to where either just before or at the peak force. And then you've got the concentric phase, which is essentially the downward side of the graph that goes to zero. All right, so you've got eccentric, the unweighting, then you've got the concentric, which is the upward movement, the flight, when it goes to, the force goes to zero, and then the impact again, when it hits the ground, you get this impact spike, followed by a little lull, and then back to body weight. So, what we're looking for is it all coming from the legs. We can complicate things a little bit by going single leg, which is, don't get me wrong, is useful. But when you are doing single leg, it's probably worth practicing this just to show you and demonstrate that swinging a leg, if you're just stood still on the force plate with one leg, standing on it, and you swing your other leg backwards and forwards and take a recording of that, you will see the force trace going up and down. So the importance of, if you're looking at peak forces, particularly doing single leg jumps, it's important that you somehow stabilize anything swinging, be it arms or the free leg, because what you're looking for is a quality in the jumping leg. Yeah. So that's why we jump with our hands on the hips, because swinging arms, adding a little bit more variability to a force trace, it gives you more impulse and more jump height, probably about 10%. So standardizing swinging movements of other body parts sort of detract from the quality that are going into the takeoff leg, if you like, for single leg jumps. I'm trying to think what else you were saying then. So we talked about the phases of the jump. What we're looking for is basically, if you ask someone to jump as high as they can, your number one metric is jump height. Another metric that you may want to look at is power or relative power as a performance outcome measure. So those would be your two or three takeaways from a performance perspective. But then all that then can be underpinned by how you achieve this. So the secondary measures to that would be how well did you perform the concentric phase? What was the duration of the concentric phase? How deep was the counter movement? How fast was the counter movement? Because that has implications on what the force would be at the onset of concentric phase. So they would be my secondary measures. Force at onset of concentric phase, which is a byproduct of the depth and the speed of the counter movement, and that, you know, puts more tension in the muscles. If you've got a less displacement in the counter movement, there's less range in which to move through, which would then mean that you probably have a shorter concentric time because you're not moving through the same range. So it's all quite logical when you strip it back. You know, it's and again, I think a lot of these, when I go back to these papers that are confusing, people go straight into these secondary measures without really putting the context of the performance there. So, you know, one of the things was in you know, come back to your point about fatigue monitoring. You know, someone once mentioned to me that jump height wasn't sensitive to fatigue, and I'm like, are you serious? Of course it is. You know, so what they've done is say, well, jump height doesn't change, therefore we need to look at secondary measures of concentric time or your peak, you know, your peak eccentric velocity. Like, what are you talking about? Either fatigued or not, because you know, with the performance output, if you can jump the same height up within a tolerance, then they're either fatigued or not. You know, so getting the right threshold based on the performance output metric, jump height or peak power, relative peak power, are appropriate for that. Understand what is normal, understand what is a fatigued athlete, get another threshold to say this is your fatigued athlete level. And it may be 2 centimeters, it could be 3 centimeters, but you need to find out what the jump height or peak power is of a fatigued athlete individually, and set that as your threshold to say, well, are they fatigued or not? You know, if they jump in the same height, you can look at a secondary metric of concentric time or depth of counter movement to indicate how they've achieved it. But for me, if they jump in within a couple of centimeters, match day -1, match day +2, whatever, I think it's down to whether you're expecting fatigue or not. And I think with that protocol in football, match day -1, you're not wanting an athlete to be fatigued. So you should have planned your program within that week to make sure that they're hitting the game fairly fresh. Match day +2, you've given them a day's recovery. So you're hoping that they will be relatively fresh. So you're not looking for, you're not expecting fatigue, should I say. When we were testing the jumpers in Aspire in Qatar, we would test the first day of the week on a Sunday, and we would test after 8 sessions of training during the week. We'd test again, and we'd see a 15% drop off in jump height, and then we'd test again on the Sunday, and we'd see them bounce back again. So that scenario, I'm expecting to see fatigue. You know, in the football scenario of match day -1, match day +2, maybe I'm not expecting to see fatigue. So, you know, you need a reference then of what is a fatigued athlete. You know.
Yeah, and in our sort of context, in the private physiotherapy practice, I think that's probably we've sort of dipped our toe and had a little look into this, but having that consistent group of people which you get in professional sport, which you don't necessarily have in private practice, probably makes the fatigue monitoring interesting, but probably not as relevant to a private practice setting. I mean, do you see things like coordination, like skill acquisition, creating lots of variability within those tests if you're
I think
in person a week later?
I mean, they talk about, again, another term that I think is clouding this whole area of jumping, and it's referred to as movement strategies. And for me, it's just a nonsense term. You know, if you ask somebody to jump as high as they can, they will find a way of performing that to the best of their ability. I don't think consciously they go, I think I need to go deeper into a counter movement today. which implies a strategy implies that it's pre-planned, and I don't buy that. So movement strategies, I think you observe rather than assume that it's a pre-planned, motivated, movement into a counter movement, for example. So, bringing in the coordination side of things and skill. If you're telling someone to jump as high as they can, just get them to jump as high as they can, whichever way they want to do it. You can then look back on the data and say, look, they achieved it this way. Is it a measure of fatigue or not? Or, some learning adaptation, who knows? But I was saying in terms of the coordination, force plates basically are giving you two things. You're looking at, if you've got an injured athlete and you want to see if their symmetry is the same, so that implies some coordination and better function, then it can give you that. So if you're looking at the two lines together and one deviates from the other, then clearly there's a deficit in function. Over time, you would hope that they will come closer together. So in that sense of coordination stroke function, absolutely, it doesn't. You would assume that the injured body part is the thing that's creating that deviation. That's the beauty of working in the return to play scenarios. You know what to hone in on. For uninjured athletes, it's hit and miss. You don't know if it's hip, knee, or ankle. Is it a leg length discrepancy? It could be anything that's creating a deviation. But when you know that you've got an injured knee, then that loading will be reflected in that deviation between the left and the right graphs. So that's basically where I don't know which system you're using now. Do you use the iPad with Force Decs Vision?
Yeah, we're having to play with both. We're using the hub system and doing it off the laptop, but we're playing around with the iPad as well.
So I think before we sold the system to Vald, we were looking at creating a video interface with the Force Decs, and we had a system going with GoPro, but it wasn't this seamless package. And through time, a few years went along, the Force Decs went to a Bluetooth system, and that meant that it could bring in video from the iPad. So you're collecting on an iPad now, you can record the athlete moving, and you get a visual representation as well as the output. So I think when you're looking at the movement at 120 frames a second on the iPad, then you can see how body weight, body position shift and whatever in a qualitative sort of way. So in that regard, I think you can pick up elements qualitatively around coordination and how people are offloading a limb, moving the trunk, or in one leg more than the other. I think that can be useful. But generally, when a biomechanist looks at coordination, we would look at more movement analysis. So just to go back a step or two, force plates give you the overall external force representation of the whole body movement. It doesn't tell you individual limbs. Whereas the kinematic side, so that's the kinetics, the kinematic side is video or movement analysis, where we're tracking joints, and we can actually plot left knee against right knee and look at whether the symmetry is there and unpick the differences in forces, that we would see externally. So I think we've got to be, it's one of those things where you can take the external force and make many assumptions, but you've got to be wary that the forces are just an external representation of whole body, if the whole body's on there. There's other scenarios where you do a press up where only the hands are on the body. That's not, it's not looking at whole body there. It's just looking at that the part of the body that's being supported on the plates. So, just be mindful that coordination and movement, do it qualitatively using Force Decs Vision through the iPad, but generally speaking, you would look at some other form of movement analysis to look at coordination.
That's reassuring. So there's still potentially a job for me to use the Mark 1 Physio eyeball and try and figure out where those forces might be being leaked, I suppose, for want of a better word.
I mean, again, that's where it goes. There's a whole level continuum of movement analysis. You've got your coach's eye, the physio's eye, where you're honing in on something, and I wouldn't dispute that a well-trained eye, knows what to focus on. You've seen thousands of people perform this movement. The underlying movement pattern. You can spot an error. I've no doubt that the coach's eye sort of scenario exists, but it requires training. To help with that training, you can get apps there's Dartfish Express, which costs a few pounds or euros. There's a free app called Visual Eyes that you can take a video, you can draw a few angles on it, annotate voice notes, things like that. Amazing little apps. There's another app that I'm working with that gives a dynamic goniometer called NSA Tech. It's an AI-based movement tracking system that can take it to another level further, where you want to track individual joints and center of mass over a sequence of movement, be it a squat, what is the depth of movement, or someone running and changing direction. So that's NSA Tech. Again, mainly 2D, which again will in most cases will probably solve 90% of the movement analysis. So then you go into the lab, for that next 10%, where you've got the optoelectronic systems, you've got bodysuits like XNs, which you can actually use outside. It's amazing. I bought 3 of those in my time. XNs, amazing. Where you've got sensors on each joint, you run around, you get very, very good detail of movement in unrestricted space. If you want to then link it to the force, that's another level on, which is your optoelectronic systems integrated with force plates to get the force vectors married onto the image of a skeleton or something that's reconstructed of the body, to then work out joint moments and joint powers, so that the distribution of load going through the body and the injured site, for example. So that's your pathway through kinematics and finally linking it up to the kinetics to then look at load distribution through joint moments and joint power. So but again, 90% that physios and S&Cs will need is a video camera on the phone with an app or a set of force plates to look at forces, load distribution, and they will solve 90% of your clinic or gym-based scenarios.
Let's keep forging on then, and let's choose violence with this next question. So the other thing that you talked about when I came, luckily enough to be invited over to John Moore's to listen to your talk and other talks about the force plates there, and isometric squat was something that caught my ear, and we'd been playing around with doing isometric mid-thigh pulls, and we'd been struggling with them a little bit because we were just finding there was lots of potential for leaking, quite a lot of I suppose coaching required to get a reasonable data stream on them. So you came straight out and said, no, isometric mid-thigh pull, put it in the bin. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
Again, the cynical Yorkshireman that I am was getting on a little bit now.
Here he goes.
I think I just see through a lot of this, and again, I think academics are to blame. You've got this need to publish information, and the isometric mid-thigh pull has been one of those examples where it's quick and dirty to get force data, peak forces equals strength. But when I went to create a solution for measuring strength with the jump squads that I worked with many years ago, we would use isokinetics. I'm interested in the eccentric strength. I mean, it's the major, or probably the most relevant mode of strength assessment that links to injury prevention. A muscle gets strained because it gets forcibly stretched. So for me, it would be your number one, you measure eccentric strength, be on an isokinetic machine, or even node board for hamstrings. There's some limitations of that being in generally more inner range and outer range, but it still gives you a measure of some isometric stroke eccentric strength, which I think has probably been why node board has been so successful. But when I look at ISO, when we were moving from university-based strength testing to high performance centers, we couldn't take the Biodecs with us, or the LIDE or the KingCom or whatever we would have. So we thought, well, how can we use the force plates, which were then embedded in the floor in some of these centers, or we had portable ones. So it was like, well, mid-thigh pull. It wasn't called mid-thigh pull. It was, do we do a pull test or do we do a push test? And we looked at it and thought consistency of positioning. Because you've got athletes who are 6.5 foot and you've got some that are 5.5 foot, we thought, well, how do we make this consistent in a force length relationship associated with jumping? And I found that putting them in an ISO squat allowed me to be more standardized and repeatable in the positioning of the athlete from a force length perspective, doing an ISO squat. So what we would look for is the bar is here, the ankle's in line with the bar vertically, the hip joint in line. So you have bar, hip, and ankle all in vertical alignment, and the knee at 135, so 45 degrees flexion in the knee. That closely resembles something like mid takeoff in a long jump, albeit on double leg. Couldn't get those positions in a pull. People got longer trunks, they've got longer arms, so you couldn't repeat it. So I honestly believe that mid-thigh pull, as it's now become known as, is very inconsistent and not transferable between athletes to get that consistent force length relationship. Compound that with leakage. You mentioned the word leakage there. It's a pull push. You pull here and you transfer it into the ground, whereas you've got leakage in grip strength. Okay, people say, well, we'll put wraps on, and we'll pull through that. You still got leakage through wrist, elbow, shoulder, and every vertebra basically. Why contaminate it? ISO squat gives you consistent position, and it's a push only. And so long as you have some padding around the cervical vertebra here, you get your grip close, you get good measurements. I've never ever had an injury. People think, oh, compression of your spine. Get that pelvis position properly, and if you want to reduce the load more, do single leg ISO squats. You know, I just use double because of the time we're testing 20, 30 athletes. But, you know, when we didn't have dual force plates then either. So it was single leg, you reduce the force as well.
Okay, so that's interesting. So you think there's possibly a benefit? Because in my mind, I thought, well, if we're doing dual force plates, we can just do a single bilateral squat and we can look at the symmetry difference anyway. So I hadn't really thought the single leg would be that useful on the isometric, but you think there's some value in looking at that as well?
I think there is. I think, you know, you've got the supporting musculature around the hips. I think you won't be able to. Well, I don't know actually. I don't tend to do single leg iso squats. You know, I've always used double, but you can see the difference between left and right. But I think it's also an option to do single leg. If you're worried about the overall force going through the spine, you will get less force coming from one leg than two. So that could be a way of alleviating that concern.
Yeah, for your injured athlete, your spinal rehab case. Yeah, I'm with you. I suppose I'd be concerned again. I don't know if I'm using the right term with leakage, but on that single leg, I'd be thinking, oh, we're going to lose stuff through the pelvis here, and that's going to contaminate it. So, but yeah, that's a great option to have. And so for posterior chain, I'm thinking again, my bias is this rehab space. So I've seen some isometric tests where people are supine and they're doing, we've played around with them here already, things like isometric hamstring into sort of a heel dig, isometric soleus loading. And I know you'll be familiar with him, John McMahon over, well, he's not at Salford now, is he? But he was for a long time. You know, they're developing some sort of protocols around that, which we've found interesting. What do you think about those sort of isolated tests? Useful pitfalls that we should be watching out for as clinicians?
It fascinates me, to be honest. I mean, John was one of my students at Salford before I went to Qatar. But having seen how people are being creative with force plates is fascinating, and I think it should be encouraged on the whole. But what it comes back to is fundamental principles. You know, laying on your front and putting your arm out and doing the IYT or the ASH test or whatever it's become known as. Personally, I've always cringed when I see that, because the last thing I would want to do is put someone nose down sniffing dirt off the ground, pushing down on the force plate. You know, okay, the body weight is your brace in that scenario, so you're not likely to lift your body weight with your hand in a position. So I think the measurement there is valid, but I'm not comfortable putting someone on a dusty surface with the nose there. You know, that's the only concern I'd have. The hamstring ones, the posterior chain hamstring ones, where you got the 90 and the 30. I don't. I've always had the luxury of having other devices. I've always had a Biodex. You know, if I'm going to measure something in relation to injury, you know, I would look at concentric eccentric strength of that muscle group on a Biodex or something. There's my number one. If I didn't have that, then yes, maybe I would use a force plate and do the heel dig 90-90 or 30 degrees, whatever. But remember, any lifting of the body in that scenario is going to take away from the force that's been registered. So they have to be braced. You need someone on top of the pelvis, pushing them down so that they can transfer that force into the plate. Any movement and deviation of the body upwards is not transferring force into the reading. So again, it's a fundamental principle of knowing where leakage of that force is coming from, to be able to make sure that you're getting as the best results as you can.
So you're telling me I'm going to have to drill a seatbelt strap into the floor of my clinic now? That's a potential.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Or you use another technology, be it the force frame or something. You know, I mean, the Nord board is designed for measuring hamstrings. Now, if you've got a concern that the Nord board is only measuring your inner range because you've got someone quite big who can't get to that force length that you would associate with where injuries occur, then what you can do is put some sort of bench there at an angle to get the knee into the right position, and just use as a concentric isometric type test of pulling up, but not, you know, the chest is supported in a position. So, you know, that is another way of using your other Vald sort of technologies to get something very specific to the hamstrings.
Okay, super. Well, I'm conscious of your time as well, so I've got a couple of questions, if that's okay, from various people that stuck things in the comments on Instagram, and I'll just refresh my memory on them while I ask you the first one, because the one I do remember is Andy who did the Life Stories podcast with you over on PhysioQuip. He asked you 2 years ago where you thought the future of biomechanics was heading, and you gave a pretty pessimistic answer at that point. 2 years on, are we 2 years on? Maybe a bit.
I've forgotten what I said. Remind me what I said.
You basically sort of said they were having an existential crisis. Are there any biomechanics left today, or how are we getting on?
There is, but you know, I see biomechanics, you know, not really being fully engaged in sporting scenarios. I do believe still that the future is wearables and getting onto the true environment, you know, onto the grass for footballers with boots on. I think that is where it's going to happen, not in a lab. So biomechanics, lab-based biomechanics, I would say, is more clinical, where you've got time with a rehabbed, an injured athlete that you're working through a rehabilitation process. I think labs will work fine there. You'll get some nice detail. But for healthy athletes or trying to unpick where there may be some risk, I think the future is most definitely on the pitch or on the court or whatever, using wearable technologies. I still believe that's where it's at. And certainly an area where, you know, I'm working with some companies now to try and make that happen. Yeah.
So when you say these wearable, are we talking about these, like I've seen a lot of wearable velocity-based training bits of kit which you strap onto your ankle and off you go? Is that the sort of thing you're talking about there?
I'm thinking more, again, trying to focus it more on the biomechanics, more in shoe systems, force measurement, movement tracking using IMUs. You know, GPS systems have been around for many, many years. That gives us, you know, really good insights into on-field demands, if you like. I think they're limited in terms of their understanding or ability to improve our understanding of injury risk mechanisms. I think the fatigue side of it is well covered by GPS, but individual loading patterns and, you know, where is the muscle being affected, at that level, it's not there. So I think something that may involve field-based assessments of loading from the ground and movement diagnostics at a more muscle level, a joint and muscle level, I think is where the future will be. I'm hoping that's where it'll be, because, you know, I saw, in my mind, I moved out of the lab 15 years ago, and the conduit for that was XNs, where you've got a bodysuit with all these IMUs on them, if you can run openly and freely on a field, capturing movement and joint loading, then why would I want to put someone on lino floor or Mondo athletics track wearing trainers when the movement positions will be different to that of boot on Astro, boot on turf, so
that makes a lot of sense.
Getting into that environment where it's valid, I think is going to be, for me, that's where I'm going.
And I suppose listening to some of these other podcasts that you've spoken on, you've spent a lot of time in that analyst space, pitch side and track side, haven't you? And is that normal for biomechanists? Is that those opportunities are quite rare? And I'm thinking of your trip out to Jamaica with Asafa Powell and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean that was just phenomenal. An opportunity came there. I have a kit bag, if you like, the Laveg speed gun, a laser gun that measures instantaneous speed. Again, it's something that gives me output metrics. If I want someone to run as fast and as hard as they can, that gives me that information like this, within seconds of them finishing that run. I'm looking for technologies that allow me to give feedback immediately, accurate data that can be fed back into a process immediately. And that's where biomechanists working in high performance sport differ from the academics. An academic's focus is the lab, and my focus has been an applied practitioner for 30 years, has been on the track, on the pitch, court side, pitch side, pool side, whatever, with technologies that can enhance that coaching interface with an athlete to make more informed decisions. And that fundamentally is the difference between a real world focus and an academic focus.
Superb. Well, again, I've got half an eye on this timer. I've just been scanning through a couple of the questions that had sort of come through, and actually, I think, and apologies if he feels they haven't, but one of them is from one of your colleagues over at ManMet, Dr. Ash Cox, and he was asking about the complexities of calculating force jumps and counter movement jump. I think you probably actually covered that already in the earlier detail that you gave there. He did ask a question also about accounting for sort of variabilities within groups. I don't know if you could talk to that at all. Adolescents in particular is sort of highlighted in his comment there.
I'm not sure there's much I can say about that really. When we were testing athletes in Aspire, we would typically see a 2 centimeter improvement a year in jump height. I mean, that was something standard. I don't think I've looked at it in any great detail, looking at it in so much depth as in a maturation point of view. James Baker was looking more along those sides. Sporting wise, there is. I think, if you look at, an athlete, a sprinter, compared to a sub-elite sprinter or a footballer, you would see differences in force traces in certain tests. But what I think I alluded to the night at John Moore's was we need to be taking a step back from just thinking about counter movement jump. We want to be looking at developing tests that are appropriate to test the attributes that are associated with the demands of different sports. So, maybe an ISO mid-thigh pull may be more relevant for a weightlifter than an ISO squat. I'm not saying it doesn't have its purpose, but comparing an ISO mid-thigh pull to an ISO squat is the different values. So I would say to answer that question, I don't really know. I'll put my hand up, I don't really know. But there will be differences in how people express force against the ground within different groups, more power against endurance and what have you. But I couldn't go into much more detail than that.
Oh, thank you. Okay, well, I keep saying I'm conscious of your time, but I really am conscious of your time now. So unless there's anything else that I suppose the logical place to finish this is, if people have enjoyed this, where can they find you? I've already sort of highlighted a couple of podcasts which I think are well worth a listen. Life Stories with Andy from over at PhysioQuip, and apologies, I forget the name of the other gentleman you did from the Long Term Athlete Development podcast. Those were great listens. So where can people find you if they want to get more detail?
Well and truly cemented at Manchester Met University now. It's p.graham, graham dash Smith, smith at mmu.ac.uk. Happy to interact with anybody. Any questions, particularly around force plates or biomechanics, then feel free to reach out there.
And I can attest to that. You got back to me within a couple of days on my begging email asking you to come on here. And thanks very much for your time. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing your thoughts.
It's been a pleasure. Always nice to talk about something that you've been involved in for many years. So all the best with your Force Decs journey, and let me know if you need any more.
I'll give you a shout when it all starts burning down around my ears. Thanks very much.
No problem.